and enslaved people on the spot. The blood ran in the gutters down to the Golden Horn, and so many hundreds of severed heads appeared in the water that a Venetian called Barbaro said it reminded him of rotten melons bobbing in the canals of his native city. As the minaret sprouted in the former capital of the Christian Empire, Mehmet took the title Kaiser-i-Rum, Roman Caesar, a title that his successors as Ottoman Emperor were to bear until 1922. With Constantinople in their hands, the Muslim forces could advance up through the Balkans. Within 100 years, they were to be at the gates of Vienna. The prediction of Muhammad had been fulfilled. Constantinople had fallen, and as the ripples of shock spread across Europe, there were two consequences that Mehmet could not have foreseen. The first was that Christian scholars fled Byzantium, bearing with them the Greek and Latin learning that was to help accelerate the Renaissance. And in Spain, news of the insult to Christendom was explicitly invoked by the Catholic monarchs as they set about completing the reconquest and the final expulsion of the Moors. If you imagine a Muslim-Christian seesaw, then the Muslims had gone up in the east, but they were about to go down in the west. We're in the Albaicin, the old Muslim district of Granada. This gypsy song is about the Moors, the Arab Muslims who conquered Spain in the early 700s and who ruled almost all of it for more than 3 centuries. The reason modern Spain is not a Muslim country is that a kind of crusade began here, as Christians in the north increasingly made war on Muslims in the south. For 2 centuries, we have parallel Christian-Muslim conflicts taking place at opposite ends of the Mediterranean. Wars of religion for Spain and for the Holy Land. Unlike the Crusaders in the Holy Land, the Spanish Crusaders were going to win. Even in the modern era, you can sense Spanish pride in that Christian reconquest. Go to Tarifa, the first place to be conquered by the Muslims in 710, and savor the triumphalism of this plaque commemorating the recapture of the city in 1292 by the Christian King of Castile. The most noble, most loyal and heroic city of Tarifa, it says, was gained from the Moors by Sancho IV, El Bravo, the Brave. You may be asking yourself who this brooding, bearded, chainmailed thug behind me is, and he's called Guzman the Good. And what was so good about Guzman? Guzman showed an almost hysterical defiance of the Moors, because in 1294, 2 years after Tarifa had been recaptured by the Christians, the Moors came again and laid siege to it, and they caught Guzman's son and paraded him beneath the battlements. Guzman stood there and he threw down his own dagger to the Moors, whereupon they slit the throat of his own son with Guzman's dagger, and then, says the Spanish guidebook, they couldn't overcome the will of the good Christian gentleman, and at the sight of his determination to guard for his king the castle, the Africans lifted the siege and went back to Morocco. And when you consider that the statue of Guzman the Good was erected in 1960, it shows the continuing power of Reconquista figures to serve as symbols of Spanish nationhood, a Spanish nationhood partly defined in opposition to a Muslim foe. That's Guzman good, Moors bad. The Moors had been running Al-Andalus since the early 700s, and they had treated Christians and Jews as second-class citizens. Now the boot was on the Christian foot. Moors who stayed under Christian rule were called mudéjars, those permitted to remain. And yet it's a measure of the Christian admiration for Moorish civilization that they commissioned extraordinary new masterpieces in the mudéjar style. This isn't the palace of a Moorish sultan. It was built by a Christian king more than 100 years after Seville had been captured.
The Muslims were cultural superior, so it was important for the Christian population. They were learning from these Muslims also. Spain is full of this wonderful mudéjar art everywhere, so when they wanted to build a house or to build a school or something like that, they were looking for Muslim workers.
If you're looking for signs of cultural harmony and mutual respect, there's this tomb of Ferdinand III, conqueror of Muslim Cordoba and Seville. And it has inscriptions not only in Castilian and Latin, but also in Hebrew and Arabic. And yet we mustn't kid ourselves. The Christians were in the ascendancy, and they asserted their triumph by stamping the signs of their own religion on the sacred buildings of their rivals. All over Al-Andalus, mosques were turned into churches. In Seville, this beautiful minaret wasn't destroyed, but adapted for Christian use. You've got to ask yourself why the Christian reconquerors of Seville didn't just destroy the entire mosque. And the answer is that if you keep the minaret, then you can express your cultural dominance. You add bells and balls and weathercocks, and so you trump the Islamic masterpiece and you say this isn't just a minaret, it's a minaret with bells on. Having taken charge, the Christians now began to put the squeeze on the Muslim population. There was increasing discrimination against the mudéjars, the Muslims who stayed behind. For instance, if you committed a crime against a Muslim, you paid a smaller fine than if you committed a crime against a Christian. There was no mixing in the bathhouses. Christian families were expressly forbidden from employing Jewish or Muslim nannies. And in 1252, it was ordained that Jews and Muslims should kneel in the street if a Christian priest came by carrying the communion wafer. And in Aragon and Castile, anyone caught trying to convert someone else from Christianity to Islam was put to death. By 1300, the Christians had reconquered almost all of Spain. Only Granada remained. For 200 years, the Granadan Moors held out, until a political development changed the map of Spain. Ferdinand of Aragon married Isabella of Castile, and they were to unite their kingdoms into a new Spanish superpower. The Pope called them Los Reyes Católicos, the Catholic monarchs. They laid siege to Granada. In 1492, they formally took control. It was here that Ferdinand and Isabella came in 1492 and accepted the final surrender of the Moors. And they agreed that the Muslims could remain here and continue to practice their faith. The Jews, on the other hand, were kicked out. And as if that wasn't enough history, for 1 year, Columbus was in the room, witnessing the deal and preparing to set off for you-know-where. As he fled into exile in 1492, the last Sultan of Granada, Muhammad XII, or Boabdil, looked back at the incomparable palaces of this beautiful city and emitted a plangent noise of regret known as the Moor's last sigh, at which his mother interrupted and said, "You cry like a woman for what you failed to defend as a man." Gee, thanks, Mum. Within a few years, the Catholic monarchs were ratting on the deal and actually compelling the Muslims to change their faith. They would